In the deepest corners of this country, beyond the highways and the cities and the places tourists photograph, there are stories whispered rather than spoken, stories about bloodlines that twisted in on themselves until they became something unrecognizable. And if you're hearing this now, consider it a small miracle, because most families who carry these shadows have spent generations trying to bury them. But history has a way of clawing back up through the dirt. Tonight, we're going to open a door most Americans don't even know exists. A door into the hidden horror of inbreeding in the United States and the quiet devastation it carved into families who thought their secrets would stay locked away forever. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. People imagine inbreeding as something distant, something foreign, something that belonged to remote mountains or far-off centuries. But the truth is far colder. It happened here, under the same sky you're sitting beneath right now. It happened in cabins deep in Appalachian hollows where outsiders rarely came. It happened in isolated farming communities where the nearest neighbor might be 5 miles away, and your choice of a partner narrowed every time you looked around and saw only your own relatives. It happened in towns where shame was a thicker border than any river, and leaving meant abandoning everything you knew. And it happened quietly, always quietly, because the consequences were too painful to acknowledge and the guilt too heavy to name aloud. But the past leaves fingerprints. Doctors found them in birth records. Teachers saw them in classrooms where certain children struggled to speak or walk or understand the world unfolding around them. Clergymen noticed them when they buried infants barely old enough to breathe. There were always explanations offered: bad luck, God's will, the harshness of rural life, anything other than the truth. The truth was considered a curse, a stain no one wanted to inherit, and yet the reason these stories still haunt us is because they didn't emerge from cruelty. They emerged from isolation, from poverty, from the brutal arithmetic of survival. Families trapped in valleys forgotten by the rest of the nation made choices they didn't fully understand, and the consequences echoed for generations. It's easy to judge them now, much harder to admit how fragile most bloodlines truly are. Most Americans don't realize how silence becomes its own kind of inheritance. In the rural stretches of this country, the places where maps blur into forests and mountains swallow the horizon, families learned long ago that speaking openly could destroy them faster than any hardship. So when the first signs appeared, they hid them. A child born with strange features, a cousin whose mind never seemed to grow past childhood, a brother who limped from birth, his bones set in unnatural angles. These were not just misfortunes, they were warnings, warnings carved into flesh. But if you lived in a place where your entire world fit inside a single valley, what choice did you have except to pretend it was fate? Isolation is a quiet monster. It doesn't roar, it whispers. It convinces you that the outside world is dangerous, that outsiders will judge you, take from you, or worst of all, expose you. Generations ago, families cut off by geography and poverty fell into patterns shaped less by desire and more by necessity. The nearest partner was often a cousin, sometimes a sibling, sometimes someone even closer. What began as survival slowly formed into tradition, and then tradition hardened into something unspoken but expected. You didn't leave the hollow, you didn't marry outside the bloodline, you didn't ask questions, and in those forgotten pockets, patterns emerged like bruises darkening over time. Children who struggled to speak, young adults who aged too quickly, their bodies wearing down under the weight of genetic repetition. Lives shortened not by violence, but by the relentless mathematics of shared DNA. Entire branches of family trees grew twisted, knotted, stunted, and yet the families themselves carried on, working the same land, following the same routines, pretending everything was normal, because admitting otherwise would mean admitting fault. But the land remembers, old photographs remember, medical documents tucked away in courthouse basements remember. And if you ever drive deep enough into certain regions, you can feel it in the air. A heaviness, a tension, as though the soil itself knows what happened there and refuses to let the truth go. The tragedy is that most of these families never saw themselves as doing something wrong. They saw themselves as surviving, holding onto the only community they had, protecting their own. But survival has a cost, and in these cases, the cost was paid in broken futures, whispered rumors, and generations marked by a pain no one dared to name. There's a reason historians call these places closed genealogies, though the families living inside them never used words like that. To them, it was simply life, predictable, familiar, and deeply rooted. But once a bloodline loops back into itself, even a little, the consequences begin weaving through the generations like a silent thread. And the most haunting part is how slowly it happens. At first, no one notices. A child seems quieter than the others. Another grows sick, more often than most, a slight facial asymmetry, an unusual gait. Nothing alarming enough to raise suspicion, nothing dramatic enough to break the silence. But over time, those little threads twist tighter. Relatives begin to look similar. Not in the innocent way cousins sometimes share a smile, but in deeper ways. The same jawline, the same sloping eyes, the same pallor, the same unmistakable echo of features repeating again and again, like a family portrait copied one too many times. Locals would try to explain it away. Strong blood, they'd say. We're a tight family. That's all. The truth hovered just beneath the surface, unspoken but undeniable. And then there were the outsiders. The doctors who visited once a year, the census takers who knocked on doors, the rare social worker who stumbled into a home they would never forget. They saw things the families didn't want to see. Households where nearly every child had the same congenital defect. Records showing infant mortality 5 times higher than the state average. A pattern of intellectual disabilities no one dared write down plainly. Some of those outsiders reported what they witnessed. Many more simply left, unwilling to confront the enormity of what they had stepped into, or too afraid to ignite a scandal the community would never forgive. But the truth has a scent. It lingers, it stains. Even today, descendants of these isolated families carry an unspoken burden, an instinctual fear of medical questions, an aversion to sharing family histories, a defensive edge when strangers look too closely. The old shame didn't die, it adapted. It learned to hide better. And in some towns, older residents still lower their voices when certain last names come up, because they remember. They remember the strange children who never went to school. They remember the parents who lived in denial. They remember the secrets that everyone knew, but no one dared articulate. They remember what happens when blood forgets to step outside itself. Some of the darkest stories come from places where the roads narrow into gravel and the houses sit too far apart for neighbors to hear each other scream. In these regions, the past isn't written in books. It's carved into the expressions of the people who still live there. They inherit the land, the silence, and the consequences. And every so often, someone from the outside stumbles into a truth the locals would have preferred to keep buried. Take the case of a traveling nurse in the mid-20th century who was assigned to a remote valley after a harsh winter. She expected malnutrition, maybe frostbite. What she found instead was a family with children who spoke in murmurs that were almost words, gestures that were almost communication, eyes that seemed trapped behind a fog. Their mother hovered protectively, refusing to answer simple questions about birth records or relatives. When the nurse reported her concerns, the county officials quietly dismissed them. The family was known, they said. Leave it alone. And she did, but the memory followed her until the day she died. Or consider the school teacher who noticed that 3 of her students, all cousins, had identical dental deformities and the same unusual gait. When she gently suggested a medical evaluation, the grandparents withdrew the children the very next day. No argument, no explanation, simply gone. The teacher later learned this had happened to every educator who stayed longer than a year in that district. You didn't ask questions if you wanted to stay, and most teachers didn't. These weren't isolated cases. They were patterns, shadows cast from the same source. The horror isn't just what happened behind closed doors. It's how entire communities conspired to keep it hidden. Pastors softened the truth in whispered confessions. Doctors wrote ambiguous diagnoses. Judges quietly sealed sensitive records. Families invented stories about illnesses and accidents to explain the children no one saw in public. And every time the truth came near the surface, someone pushed it back down, like a hand forcing a drowning secret underwater. But secrets don't die. They wait. They wait in the bones buried behind old farmhouses. They wait in the diaries stored in attic trunks. They wait in the quiet fear descendants still carry when someone asks, Where is your family from? Because some answers open doors that were never meant to be opened again. There's a moment in every buried history when the truth stops whispering and begins to seep through the cracks. And for many of these families, that moment came when outsiders finally stayed long enough to notice the patterns. It might have been a researcher collecting medical data, a journalist chasing rumors, or a genealogist tracing a surname far deeper than anyone expected. And each time, what they uncovered wasn't a single horrific event, but a generational echo. Choices repeated, consequences magnified, shame layered so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the land itself. In some counties, geneticists quietly noted strange clusters of rare disorders, illnesses that shouldn't appear in the same region unless something unnatural had shaped the local bloodlines. These findings were never publicly announced. Officials feared stigma. Families feared humiliation. Communities feared collapse. So the reports stayed hidden, whispered among professionals, but never spoken aloud to the people whose lives they described. Meanwhile, the families affected by these patterns moved through the world with a strange duality. On the surface, they were ordinary farmers, mechanics, churchgoers, men who worked the mills, women who raised their children with a fierce protectiveness that bordered on desperation. But beneath that normalcy lived a palpable tension, a fear that someone might look too closely, ask the wrong question, or follow a thread back to the tangled heart of their ancestry. Some descendants grew up sensing something was wrong without being told the truth. They learned not to bring home medical forms asking about family history. They learned not to talk about certain relatives, the ones who never left the house or never learned to speak. They learned that "we don't discuss that" was not a suggestion, but a rule, one enforced by generations of silent suffering. And yet, the truth doesn't disappear just because no one names it. It shows up in doctors' offices when a physician hesitates before asking about genetic conditions. It shows up in relationships when partners ask why certain family members can't be introduced. It shows up in late-night thoughts when someone stares into a mirror and wonders why they look the way they do, why certain illnesses run so deep, why they feel a heaviness they can't explain. By the time researchers or journalists arrive, the damage is already woven into the DNA. They document what they can, shocked by what they find, but the families themselves have lived with these realities for generations. What outsiders see as horror, insiders have normalized just enough to survive, which is its own kind of tragedy. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? There comes a point when a bloodline becomes a ghost story, not because the people are gone, but because their truth has been hollowed out, carved away by decades of denial. And in the darkest corners of America, where the land folds in on itself and the seasons move with unforgiving indifference, these ghost stories take shape in ways most people will never comprehend. They linger in abandoned houses where family portraits stare with two similar eyes. They echo in court records sealed for reasons no one will explain. They breathe in the uneasy glances exchanged at small-town grocery stores when an unfamiliar face appears. Some histories are whispered. These are avoided altogether. To understand the full weight of these hidden horrors, you have to imagine what it means to inherit a secret you never asked for. Imagine realizing as a child that every adult in your family has a story they refuse to tell, that the family tree on your school project stops abruptly because you were instructed to leave certain names out, that you look into the mirror and recognize features you share with relatives you've been warned never to mention, and the silence becomes its own kind of answer, a realization that the truth must be far worse than anything your imagination could conjure. As the decades passed, America modernized, towns grew, roads extended, isolation cracked open. But the damage did not simply disappear. Some families adapted, spreading out into neighboring counties, marrying outside the closed circles that once defined them. Others carried their histories like invisible scars, too ashamed to speak yet too burdened to forget. And in certain valleys, the silence remained intact, defended, protected, almost revered. The tragedy is not just what happened in those early generations, it's how the shame was passed like an heirloom. It shaped the way parents raised their children, how siblings protected each other, how entire communities built walls of secrecy around their identities. Shame can become a kind of religion, One practiced through silence, fear, and the desperate hope that no one will ever look closely enough to uncover the truth. But history always wants out. It leaks through DNA tests that reveal more than anyone expected, through distant relatives who start asking questions, through researchers who notice strange genealogical loops connecting names across generations, through the simple, undeniable fact that people want to know where they came from, even when the answer feels like a blade. And for those who finally confront the truth of their lineage, the horror is not just in what happened, but in realizing how hard their ancestors tried to hide it. In the end, every hidden history reaches a crossroads, a point where the weight of silence becomes heavier than the truth itself. And for the families whose bloodlines folded inward over generations, that moment arrives slowly, like dawn creeping over a valley that never wanted to be seen. It begins with a question someone is finally brave enough to ask. It deepens with the unearthed photo of a relative no one ever mentioned. It breaks open when a descendant realizes the features they once thought unique are repeated through generations of faces they were never allowed to know. This is where the true horror lies, not in the past acts themselves, but in the reckoning that follows. When a family finally confronts the truth of what shaped them, they must confront every choice, every silence, every layer of denial that hardened into tradition. They must face the reality that some of their suffering was preventable, that some of their losses were written into their DNA by decisions made long before they were born. And they must grapple with the painful understanding that love, misdirected, constrained, or desperate, was often tangled with the very acts that doomed their lineage. Some descendants respond with anger, others with grief. Some choose to sever ties completely, abandoning the valleys and towns where their last name still carries a whisper. But many simply feel lost, caught between compassion for ancestors who survived brutal isolation and sorrow for the consequences that echo in their own lives. They stand at the edge of two histories, the one they were told, and the one they were never meant to discover. Yet there is something strangely liberating in truth. For the first time, the silence breaks. The burden becomes lighter when shared. The shame begins to dissolve when exposed to the light, and the bloodline, once closed, once suffocating, finally opens. Marriages broaden. Children grow without the same genetic shadows looming over them. Medical care improves. Secrets lose their power. But the past never disappears. It lingers in the stories older relatives still refuse to tell, in the documents sealed in courthouse basements, in the land itself that remembers everything. It lingers in the uneasy knowledge that America's map is dotted with pockets of history too dark for textbooks, too raw for polite conversation. Places where isolation bred patterns no one wanted to acknowledge, and where families bore the consequences in silence. And as you listen now, you stand among the few who have walked through this archive, these forgotten rooms of American memory, where the walls themselves seem to whisper warnings. What you choose to do with this knowledge is your own decision. But understand this: every truth hidden long enough becomes a ghost, and every ghost, eventually, demands to be seen.